And now let's move on to the part I call teacher's perspective and learner's perspective.
Mhm.
And let's talk a bit about how to work with students' expectations and beliefs when you start teaching lexically. How to help them in transition from, let's say, classical approaches, whatever this
Mhm.
means, to how to reteach and relearn. What are the biggest challenges on this way?
Well, as I mentioned before, I've I found this slightly difficult to imagine because um, I really don't encounter these issues very much. Um,
So
I
students
think
don't protest
no,
and don't say like we want more grammar.
very rarely, because actually what I'm doing is giving them lots of grammar. But actually, really, what I'm giving them is lots of language, which, as we said right at the beginning, is really what they mean when they say, "I want more grammar." I mean, interestingly, I do know there's a chain of schools which use outcomes in the UK, and well, it's an international chain actually. But the director of studies told me that when they took on outcomes, that the number of comments about the lack of grammar or kind of dropped off the edge. That people were very rarely going into his office to complain about
Lack of grammar.
lack of grammar, because it wasn't lack of grammar. You know, in a way, you could say we have less grammar or not. I don't know, but the point is, there's lots of language there, and the students are forced to engage with lots of language. I think that's the other side of it. That, you know, a lot of books there's obviously pages of language in books, but often the exercises don't really force the students or teachers to engage that much with it in any kind of deep way. So it might be just the pure match word and meaning, but then not really going into how that language needs to be used. It's collocations, it's cotext, it's opposites, all that kind of stuff. Whereas, you know, I think our material does kind of push that a little bit more. So from that point of view, I think if the teacher is giving enough new language, which the students understand, then those complaints won't occur. At the lowest levels, my feeling is that students don't complain; they actually love it, because what they understand, it's easier to understand on one level, because if you start from the conversation that they would want to have, then they understand what the context much more. The part of the problem with the grammar syllabus as we have it is that we have to create these contexts which supposedly differentiate the grammar meanings, but actually don't, because grammar doesn't work like that. And so they kind of end up creating more confusion than they need to, because they're disassociated with actually what the students might actually want to say. So I think the main, if people have complaint, if anything, from our classes, is what to do with all the language. But you know, that could be just us. As I say, it's a bit difficult to know how to say, you know, what is the obstacle when you don't know what the teacher's coming from and where they're going to.
Mm-hmm. I see. And there were quite a lot of questions about, some specific context. Well, we
Yes.
already discussed lower levels. Yeah, I think
Yes.
that you've made your point very clearly.
Yeah.
Like children, teenagers, dyslexic students. Well, can
I
you
mean,
comment any on that?
the dyslexic thing, I really can't. You know, I just don't have the expertise on it. From what I have seen, I've been to a couple of talks, and actually, the main conclusion seems to be that dyslexic people would be best not really learning a foreign language, actually. that was the conclusion of one conference talk I went to see. But I guess, there are ranges of how dyslexic you are, and I just couldn't comment thoroughly on that. In terms of teenagers and children, I mean, I would say the younger the student, the more likely they need to be doing, the less likely they need to be engaging with grammar rules. It's just, they should just be learning in a normal way through conversations. I would say there's a question about whether they should really be learning anything as such, rather than just doing the activities. I think, you're moving more towards a kind of task-based type of activity, just doing some of that stuff in English. Teenagers, obviously, you can start introducing more kind of analysis, but they'd be better off focusing more on words, and then the teacher just showing how these words are used. The grammar kind of comes through the teaching of the words. So, if you're giving examples of words all the time in a kind of grammatical, realistic form, it doesn't have to be exactly the same as a native speaker, but it's realistic, then the students will be being exposed to grammar all the time. Much more so, in fact, than if they were just in these blocks of grammar lessons. This is one thing I looked at with the beginner level. So because what we do is we won't teach everything about a bit of grammar in one moment. So I'm teaching a basic conversation about your plan. Okay, so what are you doing now? What are you doing after the class? That's a basic kind of context. So what do the students need at this point? Well, they need that basic question. What are you doing? Plus some kind of time phrase, or time word, or time phrase. And then they need some responses. So in the first instance, I just reduce everything to I'm going. But rather than being a present continuous and a be going to, I think of it as I'm going plus place, or I'm going plus action. Okay, so I'm going to the cafe, I'm going to the library, I'm going home, or I'm going to have a coffee, I'm going to meet a friend. Conceptually, that is perfectly clear enough for those students. And because it's within the context of planning, there's no difficulty in understanding what we're trying to communicate. But I'm not going to teach negatives. I don't need that at the moment. I'm not going to teach them they, he, she at this, or it at this moment. They don't need it. We're just saying, what are you doing? What I'm doing? Maybe what we're doing. And so that is enough. So then we leave that, we do that conversation, we have that conversation, we notice the grammar, we show them a pattern, slightly different to the traditional one. But then, in a later unit, we will do, I think it's somebody waiting in a meeting. Where is everyone? Are they coming? She's just going to make some coffee or whatever. I don't know, she's making some coffee. And so you then get exposed to the grammar patterns over the course of the course. It's not in one block. And what happens is, because you've introduced it, you can then put it into your next reading or your next listening. And then they see it again when they come to study it in that new lesson. So what happens is, actually you get far more examples of the grammar reoccurring over time. So, I actually literally read through a beginner book and noted all the examples of kind of being, okay, whether it's be going to, or be going, or be meeting, or whatever. And in that beginner, so the traditional beginner book, you get 35 examples, and in outcomes you'll get about, I don't know, 150.
Wow.
Just because of this process of teaching it a little bit earlier, but not too much, so they can cope with it, and then understanding that they will only get it anyway over a period of time by re-encountering it. And that's, you know, how it works. And I would say that shouldn't be any different for beginners or teenagers. I mean, it should be the young, you know, children or
Yeah.
teenagers.
Mhm. Okay, but what a teacher can do if they want to teach lexically, but they can't choose the course book that they work with. It's actually a very common problem.
Yeah, yes, I know. Well, I mean, that's again one of the reasons we wrote Teaching Lexically. So the idea behind that book is really to understand that that materials which are written with this view in mind will be easier to use for a lexical teacher. But that if you, for example, say I come to, you know, if I take a beginner book or an elementary book, say there's an example, say they're doing present simple, and it's, I don't know, do you like, you maybe have examples of do you like or do you want to go to the cinema? Okay, they could be examples that you would see in any kind of traditional course book. One thing you could do is to take one of those, do you want to go to the cinema? And then develop that into a conversation. So you could start with what the book does. We can do that all there. But then we can take it a bit further by, for example, when you're going through the answers, of developing some of those questions into more of a conversation. Or, you know, very typically you'd have, you know, can I da da da? Yes, you can. No, I can't. But it's just exploring what is that next part of the sentence. So, you know, why can't I? Yes, I can. And you can just ask the students, maybe using L1, you know, what else might they want to say there? And then you can translate for them and practice the rest of it in English. So there are things, and then there are lots of texts which maybe they're not exploiting the vocabulary. We could, for example, pull out key nouns in the text, 8 key nouns, ask the students to find the collocations that go with those nouns. Or we could take them out and dictate them.
Find you mean in a dictionary?
No, initially it would be in a text. So say you got the text, you know, so you got a running text, there'll be 8 nouns in that, and then you ask the students to look in the text, back in the text, just to notice. You'd give them the nouns, maybe write them on the board or dictate them. And then you ask the students, okay, look back in the text, or do you remember first, perhaps? Do you remember what noun, adjectives or verbs went with these nouns? Okay, look back in the text, have a look. We take them. As you then going through those answers, you might say, okay, do you know any other adjectives which should go with this noun? Or we might ask questions like, why might you, how might you boost the economy? Say boost the economy was your kind of collocation. You can ask them a question, how might you boost the economy? Some of the answer would be already in the text, perhaps. Students can think of other ideas. They might only be able to think about in L1, so then you can kind of help them say it in English. And basically there are these kinds of techniques, kind of questions you ask about the language, noticing language which is there in the text, thinking about questions then to get the students talking about that language in a personalized way, then feeding back, thinking about how they would say that language themselves, what you would say, and then being able to feed in some of that in response to what they're trying to say, or just in response to what they actually say, and then moving on like this. I mean, you know, books will not every book will be perfectly usable in this way, but there are quite a few things that we could do, you know, around the text and using the language within the textbook.
Yeah. And there was also a question about authentic resources. Yeah, so I can imagine that working with authentic resources can be in a similar way.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I suppose I hesitate sometimes with authentic resources in the classroom,
Mm-hmm.
because sometimes, you know, there is a tendency, it's difficult to find sources which don't have a lot of, you know, are appropriate level to the students, that maybe include a lot of language which perhaps is not that frequent, you can get distracted by, etc. But, you know, yes, definitely you could make use of authentic resources in that way. And we do actually have a course on developing materials, which sometimes we
Oh yeah, by the way.
look at those things.
Yeah, so people again very often say that it's very difficult to understand how to choose vocabulary or how to choose chunks for teaching.
Yes.
Yeah, and there's actually, I would say, even a debate. So you also get quite a lot of questions about how you choose vocabulary items for your course books. So is it more about teacher intuition, or is it about, I don't know, some corpus-based things, or what are the principles behind it?
Yeah. Okay, I think the first thing, I mean, Michael Lewis famously said that there is no lexical syllabus and that you can't produce one. I think what he meant by that was that there's no equivalent to the grammar syllabus, in that it's a kind of fixed, accepted way of going through this, you know, the levels. But obviously you can make choices about vocabulary, what's appropriate at different stages. The other side of it, though, is to keep that kind of Lewis idea in mind, that the things you choose is that you could choose another parallel set, which will be equally valid, equally reasonable, and it doesn't matter. And in fact, the higher the level you go, the more likely that is going to be the case. You could probably have 10 different advanced classes based on Lexis, 10 different courses based on Lexis. Which
that's right.
So, at the lowest levels, I'm guided by, I mean, I make choices based on frequency. So we tend to just use the Macmillan dictionary, or some similar dictionary which has a star system about which are the most common ones. So, you know, I think, you know, if you're looking for the first most common collocation, second most collocation, and third, doing it in order in some way, then that's just, yeah, that way madness lies. We need to think of it in a kind of broad term. So, you know, try in your beginner course to make most use of, or elementary, the top 1,000 words. You know, your pre-intermediate, you should have covered, you know, a good proportion of the top 2,000 words. But even then, within that, you will always have to go outside of that kind of core 1,000, 2,000, because there will always be odd words which you just need. Either your student wants to say it, so always teach what the student wants to say, or that, you know, is on the topic you're discussing is just, you know, a central word, and so you might need to go outside your broad range. And then within those frequent ones, you want to think about what are the most common collocations. But again, you know, the way I choose those tend to be more to do with what is the conversation that the students are going to have at the end. So it's thinking about that as well. I've kind of actually started moving towards an idea of networks of, rather than lexical sets, thinking more
networks.
about, yeah. So if you take an idea, I always use this example, so sorry if anybody else has seen it already. Say you take crime, okay? So you take, I had my bag stolen, or I was robbed in Barcelona. Could be anywhere, but let's say Barcelona. And our house was robbed. Okay. Now, if you imagine telling the stories, these two stories, although we've got the key word rob, are exactly the same. Those two collocations will work fairly differently within the story. So if you take the Barcelona example, you'd probably be standing around somewhere outside the Sagrada Familia or something. Somebody will come up to you, they'll grab your bag, they'll run off or ride off on their motorbike or whatever. You might call the police, okay, which might be also what you do with the other one. There might be other stuff which goes around it. Whereas if your house is robbed, you come home, there's a broken window, or the door's been kicked in. The things they take are different. They grab your bag, whereas usually they'll take your money or whatever, computer. So, they actually, if you want to tell these stories, you actually need a different network of words. So you'll need the word, and you'll need the word rob. If you want to think of single words, you need rob, grab, run off, come up to, talk to me, scream, maybe. Okay. And the other ones you'll need broken window, computer.
So you think of a particular situation, and then you develop network of words that are related to.
Yeah. And that would be, that results, this is where we need to move away from our lexical sets, I think. I actually think lexical sets are almost as or more damaging to our courses than grammar syllabus, because it sticks us in a kind of way of thinking about just lists of words without thinking about how these words are used. It's very rare that you use all the words in a lexical set in the same conversation.
Hugh calls it human naming machine.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And, what he says as well is you can do those as collocations, but it's still the same thing in the end. It's a slightly better thing, perhaps, but it's still that kind of. So, if you're on your own and you don't have the obligation to do a lexical set or anything, and you have in mind a conversation that you want the students to have, then think about the vocabulary in that conversation. You may need to adapt it slightly with a view to their level and the frequency of those words. And that's the kind of process that I would go through.
Thank you. Let's now move on again to very practical suggestions about vocabulary teaching and vocabulary learning. Mm-hmm. Let's start with introducing vocabulary items in class. In your books, Teaching Lexically, and in your training sessions, you mentioned this horizontal and vertical expansion. Yeah?
Yes.
Can you describe it in a nutshell, and why is it so effective?
So this is not necessarily to do with words.
It's about conversation.
It's more based on the idea of how conversations work.
Okay.
So the way I think about it is, typically you have a kind of vertical way. It's basically question, answer, question, answer, question, answer, question.
Dialogue.
Question. So it's a dialogue which goes in that direction. So so the way very often we might have, what did you do at the weekend? I went to see a football match, or I went to see Dynamo Moscow. Okay, whatever. St. Petersburg, whichever you prefer. Send it. None
of them, to be honest.
Yeah, well, no, exactly. Okay. I went shopping, if you prefer. So in our conversations and in class quite often, if you're just working on the basis of grammar practice, often that will be the end point of the conversation. It will be, what did you do? I did this. What did you do? I did this. What did you do? I did this. And why I was suggesting, in a way, depending on, in using other people's material, which is not lexically kind of minded, I would be thinking about, okay, what's the next question you would ask? What's the answer to that? Okay, what's the next question you would ask to that? And I would only go through, I don't know, 3 or 4 questions. And that could then be a framework for the students to have a little practice of their own conversations. As they go round, you might need to notice other questions they want to ask, because they didn't go to see Zenit, they went shopping. And so they need different questions. So there may be those kind of ways of developing. The horizontal thing is more to do with the idea of answer plus comments, I suppose, would be my way of thinking about it. So often, as I said before, you say, would you like some coffee? You normally just answer, you could say no, yes I would, no I wouldn't, or yes please, no thanks. With the no thanks in particular, we very often give a reason. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily develop the conversation, though it could do. It's just that is quite a rich area of language that you kind of go, so it can go from everything from no, I'm fine. I mean, just on a simple level, how often do you see I'm fine taught as a phrase to respond to offers? Not very often.
Not very often. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's incredibly common, and it's incredibly useful. It's just as a simple, polite thing to say, as a rejection. And so it's that kind of thing, or I've just had one. So sometimes it will include grammar which they haven't maybe fully either encountered or fully operationalized. But that's where they're seeing this grammar reused over and over again. Okay. In terms of vocabulary, what I think we think of more is the kinds of questions which I mentioned a little bit moments ago, which are these. They're kind of concept questions, but they're kind of divergent. So they're exploring how words are used. So, I mean, the ones I really like are the why might you, or, how might you, for example. So, so they're all based on the idea of might. So they're exploring what students know about how these meanings work in their own language. So we often give the example of the word strike. Okay, so on a very basic level, we can teach the word strike, as in go on strike. It means you stop work. I mean, you can give a translation in your own language, or I could say it in English. It means you stop work because you want something from the employer. Okay, you're not happy and you want something from the employer. In the traditional concept questions, you would ask these kind of yes/no questions. So you think be things like, do you go to work? Are you happy? And it's that. Whereas the kind of questions we would ask are, why might you go on strike? How does it end? What happens when people go on strike? How does the process start? How do they decide the process? And that will kind of, what's the opposite of going on strike? I mean, that's an interesting question, because it's not the traditional opposites that we think of. But if you think about how it works in conversation, you say, well, I don't want to go on strike. I'm just going to, what, you just want to put up with it? Okay, that could be the opposite of going on strike, or it could be, I'm going to go in. So that could be the opposite. You know, I'm not going on strike, I'm going in. I'm going to cross the picket line, if you wanted a higher level.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're doing is this is basically kind of exploring the networks that we mentioned just before. So you
Mm-hmm.
kind of think, and that seems to me quite rich and engaging. And then if you then ask the students to have a conversation, would you go on strike? Have you ever been on strike? Have there been any strikes in your country, or any famous strikes in your country, whatever? All that language, you know, will be support for them. They won't remember all of it. I mean, they probably won't remember half of it, to be honest. Some of it is to do with recalling what they half know already. Some of it is a first encounter, because over time they'll learn it. So that's a first encounter. Then maybe when you do some other context, I don't know, yeah, you know, put up with it will come up with another context, and they learn it then. Yeah, so those would be how I would be thinking about dealing with vocabulary.
Yes, and what happens next? So we introduced quite a lot of vocabulary during the lesson, yeah? And how to work with the vocabulary after meeting it during the lesson. So writing down notebook, vocabulary notebooks, Quizlet, paper flashcards.
Any or all of those things would be great. I mean, I think we just have to be realistic about what happens with the students. We can ask them to do those things. We could get them to write them down. I mean, I've tried it myself and I'm not very good at it. So I think my experience of these things, so you've got a class of 15 people, like 3 will do that. If you're lucky, 3 of them will do it in a consistent way, unless perhaps it's assessed. You know, you could introduce some kind of assessment which forces them to record.
Test every lesson.
No, I'm thinking more here of you get, say you're at school, secondary school, part of your A grade depends on recording 20 words as collocations every week or every lesson. You know, just the act of writing it down and translating them, perhaps. So you make your vocabulary book, the maintaining of the vocabulary book, as the assessment, rather than necessarily testing the actual product of it, if you like, the performance.
Yeah, I see.
That may be a way of increasing the numbers. I'm not saying that's the best thing to do, but that's the reality. And then it's within the classroom. If you're asking these kinds of questions, if you have an idea of giving students more language as you go along, responding to what they say, then what happens, actually, stuff gets recycled naturally, because you know, say you I don't know, say you learn put up with in the context of striking. I don't want to put up with these conditions anymore. Then you might be in class and there's a noise outside. You might make a joke. Oh, I can't put up with this anymore. Going to complain. Or in text they have might be about something completely different. They see that word put up with. You might do some activity to draw attention to it again. And it's just a kind of churn, a constant kind of recycling. But we won't be recycling everything. It's impossible to.
Yeah, so that's the question. Yeah, when you recycle, you don't learn anything new. When you learn something new, you don't recycle. Yeah, so there's a compromise.
Yeah. I mean, there are some things which will just come up once.
Yeah.
And you can't guarantee that they will reappear again.
Mm-hmm. You mean reappear in a lesson?
Certainly reappear in a lesson, and you might even decide that they're not worth the students spending time on, you know, studying them again, maybe. And even if they, you know, even if they're doing, you know, they might, you could give them choices about what they want to, how many words, phrases they want to learn. But even if they learn them kind of rote learning, because of the nature of language, that they can't learn everything about how those words are used. So inevitably, later on, they will misuse them, or they will see them in a new context, which maybe slightly changes their understanding of how those words are worked. And so, you know, it's a kind of endless process. It's not going to be, you know, we have to be realistic about how much.
And again, so there are so many, you know, urban legends about how many times you need to encounter a word to internalize it and memorize it. Some suggestions start from 4 to 20, and
exactly.
Yeah, what a teacher should do with that, and how can we, I don't know, make sure that students revise and recycle vocabulary outside the classroom?
So the thing we take about it is that we need to ensure that the learning doesn't happen in one go. That's the primary lesson. And so that we have to re-encounter these in other contexts. I think the important thing is that it's re-encountering them in different contexts as well. So what we're not doing is simply, for example, in class, we don't want to just recycle the meaning. So say we had 10 words or 10 phrases, you know, typically we may have given them a translation or an explanation in English, okay? The temptation is then just to go, what does this mean so they give them the Russian and they say the English, okay? And there's a temptation just to do that forever. Whereas actually what we need to be moving them on to is thinking about how these words are used. So yeah, sure, we might do one revision based on the meaning. Then we might write some questions like the ones we just talked about. So why you might do these things. So some kind of, what's the opposite of, other collocations of, these kinds of things. We might set them, I don't know, if the selection of words is based around a story, then it's a lot easier then to say, right, tell another story about somebody being robbed, or somebody else you know who was robbed, or whatever. And so that will recycle it. So there's a kind of, you know, once you start, if you think about the endpoints, then that will help you to recycle more often. But we won't recycle everything, and we can't. You know, if you think of it as thinking that we need to see these 4, 5 times, 20 times, whatever, well, we need to see it at least once to begin with. so you know, it's a one step, and sometimes those steps won't be followed through on. Doesn't matter. You know, others will be, as long as we're following through on some of them. You know, I think there's an idea in parenting called the good enough parent. This is actually the search for perfection is actually bad for both the parents and the children. Yeah, and I think there's a lot to be said of that within the classroom as well. That a lot of teachers agonize about perfection, wanting our students to be accurate all the time, remember everything that we've taught them, and it's not healthy for anybody concerned.
It leads to nervous breakdowns.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, you know, just think, have I taught them something? Have I been clear on the meaning of some of these things? Have I given them opportunity to put that into some realistic practice, do something with them? And then later, have I revised at least some of it? And, you know, consciously. And then we can let some of the other stuff, just ideally the book, or just chats within the classroom, etc., just to reinvigorate those re-encounters.
self-check questions that you just mentioned, yeah?
Yes.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
am I doing the right thing? Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, in a way, yes, exactly. Yeah, I mean,
Mhm.
one of the talks I do, I have a list of questions. I mean, things like, did I learn anything new about my students today?
Mhm.
Is quite an interesting question, because if you didn't, it kind of suggests that you haven't given them very much opportunity to be themselves or talk about themselves, which, if our goal is for them to be, you know, language users, is a bit of a bad sign, I think. Certainly if it's happening regularly. You know, did I teach any new language today, which I could genuinely say the students didn't know before? Again, that's a sign that we could be just going down a kind of, yes, well, they've done that grammar. It's just a grammar lesson, really, and they're not really learning a great deal more, or they're just doing their reading, and I haven't really focused on anything. So these kinds of little questions we can ask ourselves, I think, is quite good to keep on track.
Thank you. And now we are moving to the final part. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's going to be some random personal
Okay.
questions. So the questions are really short, and you answer
Okay.
however you want. Yeah. So could you remember your experience of learning a foreign language? What was the worst and the best thing about it?
So I was discouraged from learning language. So when I was at school, my first experience was Latin.
Oh gosh.
Okay, did a year of Latin, and in our school, the people who were good at Latin went into a different class, and those who weren't went into the normal class. I went into the normal class, so I wasn't very good. Then I did French, and when I was just before I did my exam, I went on a French exchange. And I think this is the thing which always bears in mind, is that actually quite enthused me. I wasn't very good at French, and I didn't learn very well. And in the exam, all we had to do was we were given a set of questions, and we had to remember the answers. Things like, what's the Tour de France? It's a cycle race held every year in France, and the winner wears a yellow jersey. That was I can't remember the French now, but that was what I had to know. And I realised that actually I quite liked speaking to people or trying to speak to them. And so the only language I speak with any fluency is Spanish. And I didn't go to any class. Well, I mean, I went to a few classes when I first went to Spain. But fundamentally, I learned it from speaking to it, studying a bit on my own, looking up some stuff as I was going along. And so it kind of made me think that, you know, in a way, this is what then led me to respond more to this kind of lexical approach and more conversationally based approaches. Mm-hmm. That, you know, this is what matters. And that, you know, trying to help students to have those conversations should be our starting point, rather than these rather obscure questions and grammar rules, which I have no idea about.
Yeah, thank you. What are the 3 books that influenced you most as a teacher and as a human?
As a human? Good grief. Not sure about that. As a teacher, well, I would have to say the lexical approach, obviously.
By Michael Lewis. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Then I would say more recently, either of Richard Caldwell's books, which is Phonology for Listening, or I've forgotten A Syllabus for Listening, I think the second one's called.
Syllabus for Listening Decoding.
Yeah, something like that. I can't remember the exact term. I have read it, but I can't remember the title. And just generally his work. Yeah, he's a genius. And then other things in teaching, the books.
Sorry, can you put the microphone a bit closer? This, yeah. Thank you.
And then a recent book, which I think has been quite good one for human life, is a book called Stoner, and it's actually about teaching as well, because it's he's a character who he lives on he grows up on a poor farm, and he goes to university to study farming, but then discovers that he really loves literature, and he becomes a literature professor. And then the rest of the story is kind of about his on one level failed ambitions in all aspects of his life, but at the same time a kind of heroic stoicism in the face of these failures, that he clings on to his sense of self in a way which is really quite moving. So I would recommend Stoner. I've forgotten the name of the writer, I'm afraid, but yeah.
Okay, we can Google it, I think. Who is or was the most important teacher in your life?
Funnily enough, I couldn't name one. I don't think I could name one who. I mean, I remember lots of teachers, some of whom I liked, quite a lot I didn't. There was quite a lot of violence in my my schooling, kind of people whacking you over the head and shouting at you, and just general abuse.
This sort of Pink Floyd's The Walls.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yes, exactly. Yeah. I had an economics teacher at sixth form who I liked a lot, and he was partly, I think, because he chatted to us as kind of just normal human beings, and he would laugh and joke with us as though we were at the same level as him a lot of the time. Whether we learned that much about economics, I'm not sure. But, yeah.
At least something human.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I've been kind of, yeah.
Okay, what is your favorite place on Earth?
Gosh. God, they're always so difficult, these questions.
Sorry.
I do like. I've been to the Lake District. We used to go quite a lot. It's in the north of England. It's kind of, if you don't know that area, it's we call them mountains. You might call them hills because they're not that tall. But it's a very beautiful place. There's a couple of places there I really like. And at home, I like my home. It's also a place I like. And I have an allotment, which is also quite a nice place to go.
Oh, yeah. Okay, and the very last two questions, back to teaching a bit. What are the three best books to read by a novice teacher that you would recommend?
A novice teacher.
Or just any teacher. Which three? What three books should they read?
Obviously, I need to recommend Teaching Lexically by.
That's for sure.
By me and Hugh. I'm a bit lost track of what current books are. I mean, obviously those books like Jeremy Harmer's and Jim Scrivener's, so it's Learning, Teaching, and The Practical English Teacher, is it?
The Practice of English Language Teaching, yeah, by Jeremy Harmer.
I mean, they're okay. I sometimes feel that you don't get a picture. They're a bit too many options sometimes, I think. You don't get a kind of a real feel for what they believe in terms of language, particularly, actually, a view of language. But, you know, they have lots to recommend them. And, you know, there were, you know, Scott's beginner how-to books are also quite good from that point of view. Mm-hmm. I struggle to think of a good recommendation.
And what are your top tips for CPD, for continuous professional development, without spending a fortune on it?
Find a friend who you like in the teaching classroom, who you can talk about your teaching with. And if you can, also teach with them from time to time. And talk about what you did with them would be my fundamental, you know, biggest thing. Because in a sense, that's mainly, I mean, obviously, I've reading books. I think, you know, in the background, or reading anything, you know, stuff online, these kind of freebie type of things that you might think about. But I've always found, I mean, you know, basically Hugh and I are very good friends, and we've, you know, that's been a fundamental part of how we've grown as thinking about teaching. But also we had other friends at the university where we were teaching all together, which we shared a very similar outlook, and we encouraged each other. We talked about it. We adjusted the way we were going about them. We watched each other teach. And even though you might not always exactly agree, it makes you think about it. And you've got a kind of, you know, that you can talk about them to them. You're not going to be dissed or put down for it. So I would say that is the main best way.
Thank you very, very, very much for your time, for your answers.
Yep.
And we need to do two things. We need to first announce the winner of the best question contest, and this is Elina Kaneva. Mm-hmm. And that was the question about changing and developing of the lexical approach over time.
Could I say there were several which were very close. I had a struggle deciding which one it was, and I think there are 3 or 4, and I more or less stuck a pin to decide between those 3 or 4. So anyway, congratulations to her.
Yeah, and again, one more time, thank you very, very much to everybody who sent their questions. There were quite a lot of them. Yeah. So there was really a huge interest. And last but not least, we are announcing the training sessions in Krasnoyarsk and in St. Petersburg. We are totally sold out in St. Petersburg. We were out of tickets for, like, I don't know, after 3 days after announcing.
Wow, great.
So, but there is a 2-day training in Krasnoyarsk on the 13th and the 14th of April, and the tickets are still available, and there are also discounts and some promo codes, and I'm going to post the information about it with the comments to this video. And so everybody is warmly welcome to Andrew's trainings.
Yes, very much.
I'm really, really looking forward to meeting you in St. Petersburg.
Yes, yeah, me too. And now you've announced that, perhaps I can also announce that you know, we still have spaces left on our summer school
in
London, which runs. A few of the courses have sold out. A couple of the courses have sold out, but we have some short courses, for example, developing materials, better testing and assessment, teaching teenagers, and managing a language school. They're all 1-week courses, which you might be interested in. Dmitry Nikitin is running the Managing a Language School. Very experienced person, excellent speaker. And we've also got a language development course, which is for, we take kind of high-level students, so several of the people who are coming on that are teachers, If you have friends who are interested in lower levels, we also have those courses available, and we'd love to see you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for watching. Thank you.